You may well have assumed, like I did, that once the Second World War was over, there wouldn't be much conscientious objection activity. Nothing could have been further from the case. In fact, the National Security Act, which expired on the 31st of December 1946, resulted in 1947 a move by the Christadelphian community in Australia to be more preemptive in expressing commitment to non-participation in military service should the situation arise again. I read from page 156. The Ecclesias' suspicion of impending trouble was justified. The Cold War in Europe, the communist advances in Southeast Asia, and the advent of the Korean War contributed to the new Prime Minister, Mr. R.G. Menzies, successfully introducing new legislation to Parliament, the National Service Act of 1951. Some of the provisions and consequences of the Act were: there would be a call-up of males turning 18 on or after the 1st of November 1950 for service training of 176 days. Also, trainees were required to stay in the Commonwealth military forces for 5 years after initial call-up. Between 1951 and 1959, 500,000 men were registered. There were 52 intakes and 220,000 men were trained. Cabinet decided in 1959 to discontinue those call-ups. The book I read from is Conscience in Action, The Experience of Conscientious Objection in Australia, a book produced by the AACE, the Association of Australian Christadelphian Ecclesias, published in 2007. Brother George Dark recounts his memories.
I guess I had a fair bit of strong background experience in this, in being instructed, in the sense that, one, my dad, of course, having had his own background coming to the truth as a serving sailor in the British Navy. So Dad had, of course, both his own conviction of faith and his own personal abhorrence of war, because he'd been through, the Battle of Jutland and subsequent campaigns with the British Army. So he had a fairly strong mind that he actually gave me some fairly strong instruction. And then in terms of preparation, the call-up that affected my generation, and it would have been, Evan's generation and others, was the Korean campaign in 1954. And of course, Australia was also at the time supporting Britain in the Malaysian campaign. So there was quite a strong call for service people, and so they introduced the national service call-up. It was a call-up for all 18-year-olds, as distinct from the lottery type effect that became into effect in the Vietnam campaign. But on the other hand, it was a much shorter period, because we were called up for 3 months, and then there were 3 successive years, of which there was national service training, 2-week camps and all that sort of thing. But so the brethren put a lot of time into trying to help us to understand our the issues, and to try and understand probably the fundamentals of conviction. And I think the thing that really impressed me when I went through the experience in court was that that's really what the court were looking for. They really didn't care about the text of our answers, but they were really trying to get to the bottom of the fact of whether we really were sincere about what we believe. And so my own dad and the brethren who were involved, who at Granville at the time were particularly Brother Harold Wright, Brother Keith Cook, and a few of the other brethren, but they were probably those three brethren were probably the prime movers in providing the instruction, and of course Dad and Brother Wright had both been also affected by a call up during World War II, because there was a call, particularly in the later stages of the war. They were both able to prove their conscience, but they both had some interesting stories, and the sort of things that Dad was involved with a company called Sterling Henry Limited, who were cotton spinners and garment makers, and of course Sterling Henry, as a public company at the time, they had some fairly substantial contracts providing garments for the army, and in court they tried to prove that Dad's conscience was not consistent because he kept working in that environment, because his response, of course, was that you can't actually put singlets in a cannon and fire them out and kill anybody with them, but there were a few issues like that. He, in the early days of World War II, and I talk about Dad because it was, I guess, his example as much as anything that helped me formulate my own attitude as to how to face these things. There were, brethren who were keen to formulate the question and answer sort of preparation. Brethren at Granville were very much opposed to that. They said we've got to get the broadest possible understanding and knowledge of the Scriptures and what the Scriptures teach, rather than a form of words to answer specific questions. And I think, I guess in some ways, although I know, and then look back over my own depositions, I know, there were a couple of things in which I probably stumbled a bit, but on balance, because I wasn't searching for prepared questions, wasn't trying to remember prepared answers to the questions. I think I felt from that point of view I was probably better prepared, but it was a pretty daunting experience. I actually had I had two sessions, like 2 days. I went into court on the one day, and Brother Ted Spomberg was advocate there for me. The brethren on the CSC, and of course of which Dad was chairman at the time, had they'd even tried in a few of the earlier cases using a solicitor to assist at the advocacy, and the reason they did that was they felt that someone with legal standing may well be able to take the pressure off in some of the court environment, and there was one case, actually John Mansfield probably recount that in his case, where that was very helpful, but by and large it was a fairly short-lived experience, because they felt that really, overall there wasn't much, or probably wasn't anything that in the total scheme of things that a solicitor could do that our own well-versed brethren couldn't do anyway. And well, Ted had a very and has a very legalistic mind, and one of the things that disappointed me, I guess, was at the end of my case that Ted gave an absolutely brilliant summing up, and the reason, I paid £6, 5 shillings, I think, for my depositions, which was 2 weeks' wages for me at the time, but I desperately wanted them because Ted had given this brilliant summing up, and apart from anything else, I wanted that. And when I opened it up at that section, it says Mr. Spomberg sums up. The case was adjourned on the one day and over to the second week. But Ted had actually, as part of the whole preparation, he'd got me to give him, material, with things on which I was involved, and he gave evidence of my work as a Sunday school teacher. I was actually on the main speaking list, fairly recently, I suppose, but still I was on it. And he submitted the Granville speaking list and the domain speaking list, and also I was actually working with Ted and some other brethren on the study notes committee for the 1955 Youth Conference. So Ted actually submitted, amongst the exhibits, the set of notes, so the section on which, or the section of the notes on which I was actually working, which was called "Serving the Lord in the World," which was a good subject. The unnerving thing for the Youth Conference Committee was that these were my one and only final draft, and they were held by the court for a week, and because we didn't have photocopiers and all those things in those days, so there was considerable angst as to whether they would come back again, but they did. But the thing that I found in the court experience, and it was a totally new experience for me, and it was a fairly daunting one, and especially so because I appeared before Mr. Macaulay, SM, who had not previously ever given exemption. So, the likelihood for me was that I was going to follow brethren like Alan Hawkins and John Mansfield and others into detention. But that was one of those things I was prepared to do. I'd already told my employer where I was going and what might happen. And to their credit, although they had no interest specifically in what I was doing, they respected what I was doing, and they said, "Well, we'll just wait and see what happens." He was fairly intense, and of course we had a chap by the name of Braun, Mr. Braun, who was a solicitor for the Crown, and he was fairly well versed, and he knew Christadelphian. He obviously rehearsed Christadelphian things quite well, and one of the things that I well remembered was, and this wasn't actually my own case, but it was experience that Dad recounted, and I have used this wherever I've discussed this issue with young brethren, because I think it's important to understand it. And it's this issue of consistency, because there was one case that Bruce Philp was actually acting as advocate, and at the lunch break, Bruce was actually, at the time that it was adjourned, because you probably know yourself, you can be almost in mid-sentence and the magistrate will look at his watch and say the court will adjourn for lunch. Bang, there's no preparation for it, there's no lead time, it just happens, and that's what happened in this case. And Bruce was actually going through the issue of conscience in relation to using the legal resources for the recovery of debts, which of course in our listed amongst doctrines to be rejected is that we reject the concept of using legal duress for the recovery of debt. And at the lunch break, Dad and a few of the brethren and Bruce were sitting having a bit of lunch, and Mr. Braun came over to Bruce. He said, "Bruce, I'd like you to drop that line of questioning," you see. And he said, "Well, why? It's one of our fundamental principles." He said, "I happen to know it is, and I respect that the young man, I respect you. However, if you pursue that line of questioning, I'm going to have to reveal to the court a case in which I am involved, in which one Christadelphian businessman is suing another Christadelphian businessman for the recovery of debt." And he said, "Won't look that good." And now he didn't have to do that. He could have just let Bruce go and then and just pulled the rug from under this young fellow. So although he appeared extremely ruthless at times in the court, he clearly was a man who saw the issues, but he had a job to do when he got into the court. And he was constantly coming back at you with different questions, trying to get you to pursue it. And I remember, and I can't remember right now the text of the question, but I know he was asking me a question in which he was insisting on a yes or no answer. And I was trying to give an explanatory answer. And he said, "I just want you to answer yes or no." And I wouldn't, you see. And the magistrate interjected and he said, "You're hedging, lad." And I said, "With respect, Your Worship, Mr. Braun is pushing me to give a yes or a no answer, and I can't, because to say simple yes or no in answer doesn't represent what I believe in this situation." And so he just he turned to Braun and he said, "Just, drop your question and carry on." That was the thing that I think that through it all, and I had, Ted got my mother to testify on my background, and I was, and I there was just this constant line of questioning, and I'll leave my depositions. You're free to scan those. The constant line of questioning was clearly designed to show whether I was living the kind of life that justified the position that I was claiming, that that I really did have a conscientious objection to military service, because it was something that I did genuinely believe. Because they will always pursue also the issue of non-combatant service and that sort of thing. And one of the things that they pursue, if you saw, somebody lying dead in the gutter, would you attend to them? Well, of course, you're going to attend to somebody who needs some help, whether they're in uniform or not. The question is, you don't want to be put in a position on a battlefield where you have to do it. But they do pursue those questions quite vigorously. But in his summing up of the case at the end, Mr. Macaulay's comment was that one does not have to agree with this young man to recognise his fervour for what he believes. And he actually commented on all the things that Ted had submitted, and he said he could almost be granted exemption as a minister of religion. And so he granted me, full and total exemption. It's a fairly daunting experience if you haven't ever been in a court. I've had to go in on a few occasions since as a technical witness, and I felt probably was better prepared for those things because of what I went through as an 18-year-old than I might otherwise have been. It was just the total. The two things was the sort of a sort of forbidding atmosphere of being like a prisoner in the dock, because that's exactly where you go. You go. I'm not sure. I think these days they tend to be, a little less formal in the tribunals, but it was very much like, going into a criminal court. It was a court of petty sessions, and I had to go and stand in the dock, and it was just the overall atmosphere and I guess the uncertainty of what the next question would be, and an awareness of the fact that they were trying to prove my inconsistency, and therefore there's that nervousness about giving one answer that might seem to contradict another, and of course Mr. Braun, and I don't know, he may well have been a religious man, but he certainly was well versed in every scriptural verse that had anything to do with with fighting and swords and all that sort of thing. I guess I felt more relaxed in the second hearing, simply because I knew what I was going to, in the adjourned hearing, and I understood then that I think, it's difficult now at my age to really try and think exactly how I was thinking when I was 18, but I know I was very nervous, but I think I really, we all obviously all make this a matter of prayer, and I think in the end it was just a matter of, well, I will either get exemption or I'll go into detention, but one thing I won't be doing is joining the army. So it wasn't an issue of whether I'll get exemption or whether I'll have to go into the army, because joining the army simply was a total non-issue, and the option there was to go to jail, and I had already, I knew it wasn't a conventional prison environment, because we'd already been out there to visit. I think it was Colin Hill from Queensland, he was the first, I think, to be put in detention at Holsworthy. They brought him down from Brisbane. And so I'd gone out there with my dad and some other brethren, and so even though it wasn't an environment that I particularly was anxious to go into, I realised it wasn't like Parramatta or Goulburn or even like Bogger Road and things that some of the brethren endured in Queensland. When you hear of some of the experiences of people like Wally Crew, it's just incredible. So. Oh, very, very strong. Yes, very strong. Our ecclesial environment. In fact, the brotherhood generally, my experience was predominantly limited to Sydney at the time. Although I had been to the 1953 Youth Conference in Adelaide and had the issues of conscientious objection had been discussed, not in a really formal way, but had been discussed, and I had the opportunity to talk with Brother Gordon Walker, of course, who was involved in the advocacy, for young brethren in early years over there. But my experience was predominantly, with the Sydney brethren, and there was a very strong unity, in my knowledge, a very strong unity of purpose, and there certainly was in our own ecclesia, and the brethren and other young people were all very supportive. And of course, Arthur Wright and Alan Hawkins were both in our meeting, very close companions of mine, and they'd already been through the experience, Arthur first and then Alan, in whatever the outcomes were, because, the Lord God rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will, and anything we do, and that's the reason that we don't vote, because it's not our role to cast a vote when we may think, well, quite clearly we should have this party in government, when Yahweh says, no, I have another reason. Well, I guess the few stories that were recounted, and not by these brethren, not necessarily always their own experience, but in terms of their own personal case, but things that they experienced in the courts. Brother Graham Cripps during World War II, because he was he bore injuries, evidence of injuries from the First World War, and he was one of those brethren who were called up. And I well remember my dad saying that when he was being put under pressure at the time, that Graham Cripps, the suggestion from the court was that conscientious objectors are just cowards; they just don't want to go to war, and he actually gave testimony of his own World War experiences, and he said, these are the scars that I bear, and he'd pull up his trouser leg and raised his trouser and raised his leg and said, these are the scars that I bear, and he said, I was not afraid to go into war, but he said it's now become an issue of conscience. And there was a brother, and I won't mention names because I'm not quite sure about the name, but I remember Brother Harold Wright recounting a case in Newcastle where a brother was actually, being pursued on this issue of how you live the truth and that sort of thing, and there was a film running in the theatres at the time, Captain somebody or other, about a man who had been a conscientious objector, and then went through all sorts of horrific experiences, and then became convinced that he was wrong, and actually changed his whole approach and went to war and became a very successful military captain. And the advocate for the military was was actually pursuing and asked this brother, if he'd seen that film, and he said, "No, I haven't." And he said, "Well, you should, you really should." He said it would, it would change your mind. And he turned and he said, "Have you seen?" This brother said to him, "Have you seen All Quiet on the Western Front?" Yes, I have. He said, "So have I, and that reinforces my conviction why it's so bad to go to war." And one of the things that also I found helpful during my own preparation is late brother Bill McConnell, who was at this time was still a single man, but he recounted his own experiences in Ireland, England, Ireland. He was from Britain, but he said that as a young brother, the pressure of seeing Britain with her back to the wall, particularly at Dunkirk, was just more than he could bear. And so he yielded and joined the army. He joined the Navy and went into the submarine service. He said, "I very quickly realised my mistake, but of course," he said, "I was then compelled to serve out my own term." One of the things that that was really impressed upon me, and that's why I actually changed, my job. And one of the things that I try to impress, when I talk to young people about it, is that, this issue of consistency, they're looking for people who really do live a 7-day week life consistent to the claims that they're making in the court. And we ought to remember that anything we do, they'll know about. They have, the authorities that can access anything that's on record about us. So, if we've been unfavourably involved with the law, then that will reflect on us. Even traffic offences, civil offences, etc. So we have to be quite open about that, and even be proactive in a sense, and say that I always try to live according to these principles. Like everyone else, I do sometimes make mistakes, but what they're looking for is for us to show that it's a truth that's changed our way of life, not the call-up. If that's not the case, you better be prepared for a period of detention, because your chances of getting it through are going to be fairly slim. One of the things that I did find, I'm just sort of looking back, is the court are not that much interested in our identity as a Christadelphian in the sense, yes, they acknowledge it, but what they're interested in us is us as individuals. And I guess in terms of the question, one of the things that they tend to work on, and we find probably more difficult to handle, is their tactic. The emotional way in which they put their questioning on issues of non-combatant service, and that never comes out really in depositions, because they can understand our issue on combatant service. We've still got to prove our point, but it's not that hard for them to see that. They do have a lot of difficulty. They do detect, from their point of view, there's a certain sort of sense of arrogancy about us saying we are separate from the world, of which they are very much part. So there's a certain sense of arrogancy about it from their viewpoint. But there's also this issue that they try and brand us as uncaring, and their comparison. And if I remember rightly, the question on which I wasn't prepared to give a yes or no answer was in this context about the attitudes of other Christian, churches, as they say, but they don't have a problem with non-combatant service, because it's an issue of caring for injured people, etc., etc. And they conveniently, of course, overlook the fact that all military personnel have to give an oath of allegiance anyway. And there have been many cases in crisis situations where non-combatants have been compelled to take up arms to defend their position, even though they're not out there actually fighting it. They have been, people in medical corps have been compelled to take up arms to defend their patients, virtually. It's not the norm, but it can happen, and that's not our role. And they can be quite emotional in the way they put that, and that can be one of the difficult issues to deal with. Funny how little things stick in your mind. I remember my dad sitting waiting. I don't know whether it was for his case during World War II. He was recounting this experience, or for another brother whom they were supporting. But there was actually a Jehovah's Witness chap being questioned, and the question of fear and for God was concerned, and there was this sort of incredulous, are you afraid of God? And the question he was Dad said, I can't remember whether he was facing. He turned, in any case, whether it was the magistrate or the judge or whatever it was, looked straight at him, and he said, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." And that's never left me, because I think that's the sort of thing you need to keep in your mind. But and I think we also need to be always aware of the fact that we are not just named Christadelphians just because it happened to be a convenient name, but our name came about on this very issue of conscientious objection. So that, as a community, we have been identified with a stand against military service from the very beginning, and therefore, and there's always been good grounds, given for that. I thought it was an incredible test for brethren like Arthur Wright and John Burns and others particularly, and I know Arthur and John's experience particularly because we're all together, at Granville, and he was, and John Mansfield and John and David Pogson were all in there with them at the time. But they probably the biggest test. I mean, they did a lot of work as volunteers around the camp. They flatly refused to accept orders from the military. They would do work if they were asked if they would do it, but they would not accept an order. They refused if someone addressed them by the military title that they tried to give them, Gunner Wright, they just refused to answer. But if they just called them Wright or Burns or whatever, then they responded. But I always felt the biggest test was the fact that when they came out, and they wanted to pay them, and they wouldn't accept their pay. But after they'd gone home, they kept sending them the cheque, because the military didn't know what to do with it. As far as they were concerned, they should be paid for their period of detention, like any other soldier, you see. And they kept sending it back. Now those, like Arthur was heading towards getting married. John Burns was out of work, and they were very much in need of money. And it would have been a very easy thing to just quietly take the money and bank it, and nobody would have known anything about it, but they just kept sending it back.
Brother Peter Dangerfield recounts his memories of his court case and tells us about some of the questions that were not put on record.
He was the first one in Adelaide since World War II to be called up within our community, and he was given a really torrid time. His case went over 10 working days. Not that he was in court for all of those days, but quite often for most of that 10 days he was in court. And of course then I thought, well, Lindsay had a tough time, so he's sort of paved the way. They already know that we're conscientious objectors. But the magistrate I had, his first comment to me, "I've never let anybody off yet. What makes you think you're going to be the first?" You think, what do I say? And I still can't remember what I said, but I must have just sort of stared at him and said, "Oh, I've got to try," sort of, Peter Hearn was my representative, But every time he raised would raise a question or want to ask a question of the opposition, the magistrate would say, quiet, sit down, overruled. Yeah. So it was pretty much he trying to find out whether I was really a conscientious objector or not. So quite a lot of it is in the dialogue there, but I know one particular time there was some stuff that he wanted left out. He didn't want it recorded at all. It was quite specific because I had to make a judgment right on the spot. And you're in the presence of the Queen. And I thought, well, I'm pretty lucky. And he says, a terrorist or whatever comes in and they're going to shoot the Queen. Are you going to step in and kill this man? I said, no, I'm not going to kill him. Are you going to do anything? I said, well, I don't know. I said, I'll probably try and stop him from doing it, but I said, I'm not going to kill him. And he looked at me and he said, I could have you shot as a traitor because you're refusing to protect your Queen. And I thought, well, we've got Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. So righto, okay, Your Highness, or no, what was it? Your Worship. That's your prerogative to have me shot as a traitor. I said, but in the eyes of my God, I'm not. And he said, oh, so you're prepared to be shot? I said, if that's what you are going to do, yeah. I said, I'll appeal, of course, but if that's your judgment, then fine. And I'm thinking, that's all right, because I've won, really, haven't I? I'm not going off to war. And whether he saw that, I didn't say that, but I said to him that it was his prerogative to have me shot as a traitor, but in the eyes of my God, I'm not. And I think that sort of went on for about 5 minutes, toing and froing a little bit. And then he said, well, why do you reckon that, you're going to be raised, sort of thing? And I just said, look, there's these 3 guys in Babylon. And I went back to Daniel and I said, the king told them to do something too, and they refused. I said they just didn't want to bow down and worship the image that this king had made. And so he had them thrown into this great fiery furnace. And I said they were saved and his men were killed. I said, and what they said was what got me. I said, it didn't matter whether God stepped in and rescued them or not. It didn't matter. They saw something further on in the future. They said, whatever you do, O king, whether we die or live, we will not bow down to your idol. So I said, it's a similar thing. I'm in a lion's den, if you like, or there with these 3 guys. You can have me shot, but it's not going to worry me. And of course, Mum's sitting in the front row there, and I'm thinking, yeah, righto, what's she thinking? But I'm thinking, well, look, I'm standing up for what I believe in, and if we're not prepared to die for that, then, where do we go? What are we really doing? And at the end of that, he just then carried on. He said, okay, from now on, we're open to taking the notes again, and you can do your recording to the recorder there. At the end of it, now the session was only meant to go for a couple of hours. It started at 10 o'clock in the morning, didn't finish until 6 o'clock at night, and it was a fairly torrid time. And right at the end of it, he summed up and he said, I find that you truly do have a conscientious objection to all forms of military service. Therefore, I have no hesitation in freeing you from this call-up, and you're free to go. But probably one of the most incredible things that struck me was that I was doing the line training course at the time with PMG and learning to be a liney and do telephone installation. And of course I had to go to my supervisor and say that I'd been called up. And he said, oh, well, we can get you off for 18 months and do that as a training thing. And I said, oh, no, you don't have to worry, because I said I'm a conscientious objector. And I thought, just that statement is going to put me aside from all the other men there at the school. And I wondered how they would all take it. Now, on the day before, the evening before the court case, as I was coming out of the classroom, the supervisor came up to me and he said, Peter, I wish you every success for tomorrow. he said, my son's just gone off to Vietnam. And that I was just overwhelmed with that, because he didn't have to do that. But he came out as a father figure, and you know, and I felt really, really good, because I thought he took the time to come out and speak to me and wish me the best. And of course, when I came back on the Monday, he was just absolutely, rapt. He said, so you've got through all right. But the downside of all of that was, one of the questions the magistrate asked me was, had I ever experienced anybody very close to me dying? Now, that was on the Friday, and on the Saturday morning we got the news that Ian Robinson and Phil King had died in a car accident on their way to Mittagong Bible School. Yeah, and we'd grown up. I mean, that was a 16-year friendship, just wiped out in seconds. So that was the toughest, I think, of the whole lot. Well, his question at the time, have you had anybody close die? And I said no, and I said I really don't want it, but I said I would imagine that it would be pretty traumatic. Well, it turned out it was one of the most, if not the most, traumatic time of my life. Most of the guys I worked with never chastised me. I had more problems with the people I worked with up in the Northern Territory. There was one, we were working out on the Australian space base out there at Pine Gap, installing all the telephones and putting in all the cables. It was just being built at that stage. And I was with a group of 5 men, and one day one of them said to me, "Oh, you should be in Vietnam with all the others." And I said, "Oh, well, I'm a conscientious objector." "Oh, well, I can't use the language that they used, but it was early in the day, and they said, well, you're not going to be drinking out of the same bottle we drink out of for water. We're not going to have you drinking from our water bottles." Well, there were 4 water bags on the truck, so they each grabbed a water bag. And I thought, oh, well, okay, we're going to have to get through the day without water. And so I just worked away steadily, and got home that night and just guzzled and guzzled and guzzled. And the next day we were working, and one of them came up and offered me the water bag, and I said, "Why, what's changed?" And he said, "Because you didn't carry on." He said, "You just accepted whatever was, you just went ahead and did your own work and didn't complain." And he said, I was impressed with that. But yeah, there were different occasions, different people had different ideas on conscientious objection. Some soldiers I'd spoken to, guys who had been soldiers, they said, well, we all have to fight our own battles anyway. And they saw that I'd fought a battle with the magistrate, and therefore I'd done my bit, so they wouldn't complain about what I did, because they said, oh, I wish I'd done something like that too. Now, I probably found a lot of people, even though they might have opposed it, said, oh, well, look, because you were called up, you should have gone anyway. And I said, yeah, but you're thrilled when your sons don't get called up to go over. Oh, yeah, but that's different. I mean, if they did get called up, they would have gone. I said, yeah, well, I got called up, but it's not just Vietnam, it's all sort of warfare. And they sort of a lot of them couldn't see that, or wouldn't go beyond that. But they were quite pleased when their own children weren't called up or missed out. Well, Peter Hearn was doing evenings, and we'd go through a bit. But I probably didn't go to a lot of them, and I think that was, in the end, to my benefit, because there was another brother who went through after me, and he had a very tough time right at the end. I still can't quite work out how he got off, because the magistrate was quite blunt in saying to him that it had been quite obvious he had been schooled in what to say. Yeah, so it's a pretty tough one, because I I think, being 20 and you're facing a magistrate, and some of the questions they ask are pretty difficult. I found some questions he asked, and as he's asking the question, I'm thinking, goodness, what am I going to say? And all of a sudden the answer would be there. And he wouldn't say anything more. He'd carry on with another question or with a different scenario or something like that. But the answer would just suddenly be there, bang, and hit you like a ton of bricks. And you just, wow, did I really say that? And all these other things are going through your mind at the time you're trying to answer questions and work with a magistrate and sort of try and be at ease in a court case. I don't think any court case can be easy because you're never at ease in there because you never quite know how or where you're standing with any of them. And other questions he would ask and go over and over and over or put them in a slightly different way. Things like, okay, you're hungry and there's an apple hanging over the fence. Would you eat it? Probably would. Okay, it's not hanging over the fence. Would you eat it? Most probably not. But you're hungry. Why wouldn't you eat it? Well, it's, obviously not mine to eat. Would you go in and see the chap? I said, if he's there, yeah. But I'm not going to go in and say to the guy, oh, can I grab a couple of your apples and eat them? So I might say to him, look, I'm hungry. Can I go and have something to eat, please? And, another one, you see a soldier dead on the road. Are you going to give him a Christian burial? They will. What's a Christian burial? Tell me what a Christian burial is. I said I'd probably dig a hole, pop him in and cover him over and let the authorities know what I'd done and where I'd put him, or even take his dog tags and that sort of thing. And say, this is the guy that I found, I've put him in such and such a spot. And you might well say, whatever it is, that he'd probably died hopelessly, I don't know. I said, what is a Christian burial? I can't give him a Christian burial as I'd give my brother a Christian burial. But, some of the questions are quite, sort of obtuse, difficult, irrelevant almost. Well, I think most of it was, I was given the transcript of Lindsay Wallace and went through that fairly thoroughly. And I'd made up in my own mind that, okay, using certain scriptures, both in Old Testament and New Testament, and I can't remember all of those either now, but having certain scenarios where different ones have stood up for God and for Jesus and have put their lives on the line for it. And that was where I took a lot of my my standing from. I was hoping that we could, at least somewhere incorporate those different, and most of them I could and was able to. So look, this is an example, and hopefully I would be able to follow that example in that particular situation. But it was nice to have Peter there, nonetheless, because even without his presence, I think I would have been at a loss. And knew that Peter could at least back me up or even ask a question of a particular situation and ask it so that I could fill it in a little bit more or make it present it better. How did I feel? Well, most of it I think I was feeling for my parents, because I thought, whatever the outcome, they're watching their son, their eldest son, who could be going off to war or whatever, or who's going to have to make a stand beyond this court case. Absolutely, and I tried thinking back all the time that if you're making a stand for God, then He's standing with you. And I thought, but it still doesn't take away that feeling, that fear of that you're not really doing too well. Are you putting too much in yourself? Like you're relying on yourself too much, or are you hoping that God's really there and going to give you the answers? Because He doesn't give you every answer. He'll give you some, but not every answer. And that's what I found. Some I found very difficult to answer. Others, they just seemed to spring in at a moment's notice, and you'd be on to another situation. I can tell you that I walked in with shoulders that were weighed down with, worry and concern. I walked out as light as a feather, I think. That would be the absolute difference. The reality of being able to just walk out there a free person, that you didn't have to put in another appeal or anything like that. That I hadn't been through another 2 weeks like Lindsay Wallace had been. In reality, I thought 8 hours is not a bad session. All I can sort of remember is just walking out of those doors and going, thank you, God, for getting me through this.